Hello and welcome to the World Discord podcast. I am Joel Ostrow and we're here with Brian Endless, your co-host for this podcast.
Hello, Joel.
Hi, Brian. We discuss a different hot zone or hot spot or conflict zone around the world each week. Although this week we have decided to discuss a couple of entities that have been very much in the news of late that are devoted to uh, adjudication of disputes either during or after conflict, namely the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. Recently, South Africa and I believe some other states brought charges against Israel to the International Court of Justice. And the International Criminal Court in recent months has issued warrants for Vladimir Putin, Benjamin Netanyahu, Sinwar of Hamas, and various of their subordinates. So, what are these things? That is the focus of our discussion today. And I will say that I have some knowledge of these things just through other things that I do. Brian focuses on them much more directly. I think that's right. Am I right about that, Brian?
Yeah, that is accurate. Yep.
So, just for a little background, though, the International Court of Justice, sorry about that, is what is commonly referred to as the World Court, and it has a deep history. Really, predecessor organizations devoted to international arbitration date back to the late 1700s in disputes between the new United States of America and the United Kingdom. I'm not going to trace that long history, Brian. Maybe you want to go through some of that. But after the Second World War, it was reestablished in its current form as the International Court of Justice. The judicial arm, I guess we could call it, of the United Nations. And its primary function is to hear disputes between states or charges by one state against another. The International Criminal Court is a much more recent creation established by the Rome Statute in 2015. It is a criminal court. It hears cases against individuals. It is independent of the UN formally, and some describe it as having been created in a good deal of frustration over both the UN and the ICJ's deficiencies, limitations, particularly in the wake of the late 20th century genocides in Bosnia, Rwanda, and elsewhere. It should be noted that the United States, Russia, China, and Israel are not members of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, though the United States' relationship with that court is complex, even complicated. It is certainly involved in it. These are both located in The Hague, the ICJ in its long-standing location in the Peace Palace, and the ICC described as a cross town. I've never visited that. It's a newer creation. So that's sort of a cursory introduction. Brian, maybe first I should turn it over to you and fill in the gaps of what everyone might need to know, just as a introductory on these two things, and then we can sort of go into what they actually do and what's going on with them today.
Sure. And you gave a really good primer, Joel. Basically, what we're looking at is two very different courts that often get confused, and international justice is convoluted in that way. The International Court of Justice had a lot of precedents. The biggest one was the Permanent Court of Justice that came out of the League of Nations after World War I, and that turned into the International Court of Justice, which is a part of the UN Charter. So it is one of the central arms of the United Nations.
Let me interrupt right there. So is it the case that all members of the UN are automatically, I guess, parties to the International Court of Justice? In other words, they can't opt out?
100%. Okay. Nope, the ICJ is one of the primary organs of the UN. You cannot opt out of the ICJ. That does not mean that countries don't opt out of cases all the time.
UN,
Sometimes
right?
when
UN
it's
resolution,
for them. Yeah. Well, and this is one of those. One of the reasons the ICC exists is the ICJ did not really fulfill any criminal justice function at all. A few countries have tried to use it that way. There was a 1980s case, Nicaragua versus United
Mm-hmm.
States, when the U.S. mined the harbors of Nicaragua. Nicaragua won the case, but the U.S. chose to
Right.
ignore that order and said that the ICJ didn't have jurisdiction. And that's been an easy out for way too many
Has the
countries.
U.S.
A
brought charges
basic
to the ICJ against anyone
I
successfully?
don't know of anybody that we brought
Because I remember
charges
in the early
against.
days of the WTO dispute body, the World Trade Organization
Right.
dispute body, um, the United States brought a case. Forget against who, and won, but then some other state brought a case against the United States, and the U.S. lost, but the U.S. chose to ignore the verdict. So
Yeah, but you know what? At the WTO, actually, there have been examples of the U.S.
mhm.
losing and not
Mhm.
ignoring it. So there was the infamous dolphin-free tuna
Yes.
case against Mexico, where there were too many dolphins in the tuna fish, and we'd passed regulations. So the U.S. has accepted some of these
Okay.
cases, and a lot of times the question on these is
Yeah.
politics. And this is, I want to jump to the middle or jump to the end, I guess, on this one. Both of these courts are still political. And I teach international law, and I regularly argue to my students we need to stop imagining that there is a difference between law and politics. We need to stop imagining that there's some kind of objective law out there, either domestically or internationally. Laws are made by political bodies. Laws are made by politicians, either countries and the politicians who lead them or the politicians making national laws. To think that laws are objective is silly. Now, when we get into the international realm, we have to add power politics
Right.
onto the normal issues that we get in the domestic realm. And we can talk about those with both the ICJ and ICC cases that involve Israel and to some extent the US. Let's go back to
Let's
history
go back
real
to the
quick, though.
ICJ. Yeah, yeah.
A very quick history in the ICJ. The ICJ has not had that many cases. They have two, three, four, five cases a year is typical. They are almost always at the end of intractable treaty
Right.
disputes. So country A and country B have a dispute over their borders, over whether some mountain range is in their borders. They may agree to take that to the ICJ. Sometimes one country sues another. That doesn't often work out. The other country often just says, no, there's no jurisdiction. But it is not uncommon that two states come together and say, hey, we actually do want to resolve this thing, just like parties do in national law. And we'd like a court to step in and make the decision for us. And then they bring all the legal precedents in and all the prior treaties, and they interpret the treaty that's there, and the ICJ makes a decision, and the vast majority of the time the states follow those decisions because they brought it to the ICJ voluntarily. So that's when the ICJ is at its best. There have been other times, though, where the ICJ is asked to give an opinion. And that's what happened in this Israel case. South Africa started the case. There are now many states who have signed on to it. And the ICJ has been asked to give an opinion over whether Israeli behavior in Gaza may amount to war crimes or may even amount to genocide. We'll go through that individually. There have been a number of ICJ opinions in the past. One thing to remember is it is often years before the ICJ makes any kind of decision. So a 4 or 5 or 6 year process is typical. This is not a fast moving court. And also, the court has no enforcement power, and the ICJ has never had enforcement power. The UN Security Council can choose to enforce ICJ statements and ICJ decisions as law, but that has permanent members vetoing it if the Security Council is going to enforce it. So when the ICJ comes out in cases like this, it's legal standing and it's moral standing, and then it's a question of how those play into the political situation.
Let me ask you this, Brian. Um, you indicated a couple of different scenarios in which the ICJ might become involved. One is involving the state parties themselves to the dispute. You said two states might have disagreement over which country has jurisdiction over a particular piece of territory on the border, and the two states might appeal to the ICJ as an independent arbiter of that dispute. And that, I think, is the longer tradition of historical tradition that I mentioned in the introduction. But then there's the situation now with Israel in which an external entity, one that is not directly a party to whatever the dispute is going on, brings a case to the court. Um, is one of those scenarios more common, or um, more envisioned in the charter of the ICJ? Because my thought is more of, and what I know the ICJ most about, just from my own really teaching, is the latter, meaning there's some kind of um, violent conflict with war crimes, and someone else brings the aggressor, the offender, to the ICJ. That's what. So to me, that's more common. But when you describe the broader purview, I would imagine maybe that it's the other that is more common.
It is. I don't think the founders of the UN particularly envision the ICJ stepping in when there's active conflict
Mm,
going on. That's not a good role for the organization. That's much more. Remember, the ICJ is part of the UN Charter. That's what the Security Council was intended to do. If any part of the UN is going to step in, it was the Security Council. The ICJ has almost always been used, vast majority of the time, to settle those disputes between states that are legalistic disputes based on some type of international law, whether treaty law, customary law, or whatever the case might be. And more recently, it's been used this way. And when the ICJ has come into play in disputes, what usually ends up happening is the Security Council or the General Assembly asks for a legal opinion. They ask the ICJ to step in and make a statement on whether something is legal or not. So, this kind of case with Israel wouldn't have likely happened out of the Security Council, as an example, because the US, possibly others, would have blocked it. But this is kind of a normal place where the Security Council or GA could step in. What is legal but is very rare, and I don't actually know of another case off the top of my head, there may be one, is this case of South Africa as a member state fulfilling its rights to ask for an ICJ opinion, and to ask the ICJ not just to give an opinion, but to step in and to stop a
which, how
conflict.
could they do that?
Um, they
Right.
can't, and people realize that they have a legal right to make a legal statement that this shouldn't happen. But as I said, South Africa knows full
Right.
well that the ICJ was going to take
Yeah.
years to decide this. There are beginning opinions, there are introductory opinions. The ICJ made one early on. They refused to say that Israel should stop the conflict, even though they suggested that there were reasons to investigate the case. That's the kind of thing the ICJ would do. The most recent statement that the ICJ made, again, did not say Israel should stop this conflict. They did say that Israel should cease future behaviors that might amount to war
Right.
crimes. And then they use some very specific genocide
Yeah.
language that we should talk about. But the ICJ has no power to enforce these things. And in reality, their statements weren't something that was meant to be enforced. That being said, they're embarrassing to Israel. They're embarrassing to Israel's
Yeah.
allies, and in no small part because Israel says everything they're doing is
Right.
legal. And now they have an international, relatively objective. Israel, of course, like anyone who is accused of something, will jump in and say, "Oh, they're not objective." But yeah, no, the
We have no
ICJ is
experience with
objective.
that in our country right now.
No,
None at all.
none
Yeah, we're totally
whatsoever.
unfamiliar with that.
Yep.
Let me ask you. Well, until fairly recently, if you had asked me, true or false, the World Court, the International Court of Justice, is an outgrowth of the Nuremberg processes, I would have answered yes, but that is very much not the case. Um,
100%
but I think
not.
most
The
people would
idea,
answer yes to that.
100, yeah, absolutely. People hear international law and they conflate everything
Yeah,
together. They want to think of it as one big system. It's
right.
not. It is multiple systems. So the International Criminal Court is a direct outgrowth of the Nuremberg process from the war crimes
And yet it was created
tribunals in
60
World War
years
II.
later, whereas the ICJ was created contemporaneously with the Nuremberg processes, along
Exactly.
with the
Yeah.
UN. And I think that's part of why the association.
Exactly. And effectively, as you said in the beginning, the ICJ effectively predated the UN. They took the
Yeah,
Permanent Court of
yeah.
Justice from the League of Nations and they updated it a little bit and put it in the UN because it was kind of a good idea, because it made sense to have some justice mechanism that was objective that could help states when they had disputes on treaties and things
Yeah.
like that. The Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals, though, the Nuremberg process was to determine individual
Hmm.
accountability. And they were what are called in legal terms ad hoc
Right.
processes. The Nuremberg tribunals only determined individual accountability for Nazi crimes in
Yeah.
World War II. The Tokyo tribunals only determined individual accountability for
Japanese crime.
Japanese. Then we need to skip forward to 1993,
Can we
1994,
pause on that for a
and the
second?
former Yugoslavian Rwanda
Yeah, yeah,
tribunals.
yeah. But before we get to that, and I think we should do that next. But I do want to make clear, because I don't know the answer to this. Did the ICJ have any role at all? Were they tapped at all in the situations in Cambodia or Rwanda or Bosnia or any of those sort of genocidal kind of conflicts that we might think of from the late 20th century or early 21st century?
They were
We're
not.
not.
Those were ad hoc situations. They were mostly solved politically.
Mhm.
In many cases, there were tribunals that were held
Right.
inside of countries. So it wasn't unusual at all to see one side win and hold tribunals to hold the other side accountable. And then we get to the Security
Mhm.
Council for the first time since Nuremberg and Tokyo, approving the ad hoc tribunals for former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda. And this is in the early
Okay.
1990s. So from 1945 to 1994, there was no international level
Right.
accountability for individual
Right.
crimes. The ICJ, to be really clear, the ICJ is between states.
But that raises the question,
Individual
like, why? What would be your answer? Why was the ICJ process not invoked for any of those cases that I mentioned? I'm clearly any state could have brought Cambodia to the ICJ or brought the Rwandan government or brought Serbia, for example. Like, why did that not happen?
So there were a couple of things going on there. The first is the Cold War. And your question is excellent, and it is very post Cold War
Like
contemporary.
1990s, Bosnia, Rwanda.
But early 1990s, we're still in a Cold War
Uh,
mentality. But we took a step beyond it. I'd like to suggest that in the 1990s tribunals, we went in a good direction.
mhm.
Internationally, that is, we went in a good direction to hold individuals accountable. During the Cold War, there was not going to be any holding individuals accountable because the US or the Soviets, sometimes the Chinese or the Brits or the French, were going to block it, and they were going to make sure that that didn't happen and that that didn't come before any of the UN bodies, which is the same reason. Again, you could ask, why didn't the Security Council step in on these? The only time the Security Council stepped in was on Korea in the 50s, and that's because the Soviets were stupid and they left the room.
Oh, well, but
Um,
Kuwait. It's kind of interesting that in the Kuwait situation, in some, I don't know, fantasy utopian world, one could imagine, instead of invading or sending instead of a Security Council unanimous resolution and invoking the charter and having a global action, to remove Iraq from Kuwait. In that utopian world, one could imagine suing Iraq and going to an international court of justice, having a ruling in Iraq saying, "Oh, our bad, we'll leave now," and having some penalty invoked, like in a court system. It's fantasy.
I love this discussion because I've had it many times
Oh,
before, and I'm going to give you the exact same answer I give everybody
uh-huh.
else. We don't live in
Right,
utopia.
yeah.
We live in a
Right.
realistic world. And really, this is one of the places I study the Security Council even more than I do the
Right.
international law bodies. This is what the Kuwait is what the Security Council
Hmm.
was made for. It is not what the international courts were made for. People understand and have understood all along. Courts take too long. You don't want to go to courts to stop an invasion. You want a military force to stop an
Yeah.
invasion. Kuwait, with George H.W. Bush and the New World Order, and the United States actually pushing for international alliances and putting together a gigantic alliance, including the Arab
Remarkable.
states, including getting Russia and China to sign off on it. That was a
Yeah.
massive step toward international peace and
Yeah.
security and toward bringing us back into keeping with international
Oh,
law.
and
So
even
they
more so,
absolutely
not pressing on to Baghdad despite his advisors, who then got George
100%.
W. Bush to do what the father didn't do. But anyway, that's a whole nother story.
Absolutely. And you look at the back and forth on those, absolutely. But that Security Council resolution in 1990 that authorized the 91 invasion clearly said Iraq was in violation of international law. The Security Council can also make that determination under the UN Charter. They can act for that reason. So I'd actually suggest there wasn't a need for the ICJ
Yeah.
there, that this was the UN fulfilling its role for the first time, possibly ever, in the way that the founders expected it might be fulfilled right before the Cold War started.
Although in all these situations, the World Court, the International Court of Justice, but it's commonly referred to as the World Court.
Yeah,
Um, its reputation declines more and more because these kinds of conflicts continue to happen, and there's this perception that the legal entities are a joke because they do nothing to prevent or to hold accountable for these things. You're suggesting, I think, that that's not entirely what this court was envisioned, the role it was envisioned to play, or there was at least a realism that recognizing that it couldn't do that, but it is still important in those other areas where it is able to adjudicate lesser disputes, if you will.
it was one of my favorite quotes is from the second Secretary General of the UN, Dag Hammarskjöld, and he said that the UN will start to work when everybody stops to think of it as this abstract
Yeah,
painting that's supposed to do all things for all
yeah,
people. And that's a paraphrase. That's
yeah,
not a direct quote, but that's exactly what you're talking about. Yes, people expect the world courts to do something, the ICJ and now the ICC. That is a completely unrealistic expectation.
yeah,
There's no reason people should expect that, but we have created this utopian reality. I think you're using good words there. And we want to believe it because, in an objective, perfect world, it
it
might be
would, yeah,
true. And yet, I'm going to recommend, or I'm going to suggest that especially the ICJ is very much a product of the real world, the
for sure.
realistic world of international law. The
It's
ICC is
more
interesting.
idealistic, yeah,
When the ICC started, I was not a
mhm,
fan only because I didn't think it would ever
yeah,
do
yeah,
anything. This situation with Israel and Hamas is starting to move me a
yeah,
little bit into the other direction on the ICC, but the ICC seemed really
yeah,
idealistic from its beginning,
yeah,
and now we're starting to see a little bit of what the ICC founders were looking at. But I think the key answer to your question is we need to, this is a place where most people simply aren't
yeah.
educated enough about the process to understand whether it's working or not.
And last question I have about the ICJ: um, who hears the disputes? Like, who are the judges, and who tries and who defends, if you will? Like, who are the prosecutors? Who are the defense? Who are the judges? And you referred to investigations. I believe they have quite a large team of their own legal experts, judges, lawyers who do their own research on these things. So it's different than a regular court. Like, Judge
Right.
Mercham did
They,
not have his own investigators trying to figure
right.
out what Trump did or didn't do, right? So it's a totally different
Exactly.
process from a court. Yeah, to the extent you're able, can you outline that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. As briefly as
Yeah.
possible. There are 15 judges. They're selected from international legal systems around the world. The P5 are often represented. US, Britain, France, China, Russia are often represented. When you have a case brought before the court, you are automatically also given a judge from your legal system. So in this case, an Israeli judge joined the court anytime
And
Israel
how many
is brought
judges hear a
before.
case? Is it all 15?
15 always
All
hear the
15.
case,
Wow.
and then any extras that come on. They have assistants, they have people who do research
Uh-huh.
for them, but this is not a prosecutorial
Okay.
court. So what happens here is the two sides provide evidence. There can be states that join in for one side or the other. And then there can be what the legal system calls amicus curiae briefs, friend of the court
Right.
briefs, that can be given by any expert agency. So if it's a human rights issue, Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch might give a brief. There might be a UN agency that gives a brief if they have some expertise on it. So different organizations can also provide those briefs. And then the judges rule on the law. What they have their staff for is to assist them in going through the existing law, because sometimes these are incredibly complex things with lots of previous cases to look at, lots of different laws that come into play, different interpretations of different laws. You just look at all the war crimes statutes that are out there. You have to compare and contrast not just the words of the statute, but what was intended by them, how they've been interpreted in other cases, what legal experts say, what past cases say. Past cases aren't precedent, by the way. They are evidence. So they're not definitive like in the US system, where if there's a past federal case, you have to follow that. But in the international system, past cases provide strong evidence. So you put all that together, and then after both sides, just like in the US civil system, after both sides have gone at it, the judges make a decision.
Gotcha. Well, let's turn to the International Criminal Court. Now, true or false? The International Criminal Court is loosely based on what we're seeing as partially successful uh, tribunals, the International Criminal Tribunal for Bosnia Herzegovina and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. Was the ICC, its charter provisions, was it largely inspired by those tribunals?
I would actually suggest something different, that it wasn't inspired by those tribunals, but it was inspired by the failure of those tribunals
Okay.
and by the fact that they just didn't work very
Mm-hmm.
well. The idea of an ICC existed before that. Your dates were a little bit off, by the way. The Rome Convention was in 1998, and the treaty went into force for the ICC in 2002, not 2015. So it was a little
I
bit
read too.
earlier.
Okay. I don't know what the
we,
2015 is.
we can go back and look that one
Yeah.
up when we need to.
Yeah. Okay.
But see, the experts disagree
Mm.
sometimes
Or
when you
just
go
ignorant.
through
I'm
these
not no expert on this.
things. But here's the deal with the ICC. There were complaints, primarily post Cold War complaints, because this didn't come up during the Cold War, because both sides felt they were absolutely right and the other side was absolutely wrong. There were post Cold War complaints that we had leaders who were not being held accountable for their actions. And that these individual leaders, let's take an example of Hitler in Germany, and the Nuremberg tribunals were absolutely a piece of this. Hitler and the other leaders in Germany were much more culpable than the people they gave the orders to. That does not mean the people they gave the orders to weren't legally in the wrong. They were. But the idea of the ICC is that there should be an international court that goes after the top people who are responsible for the worst crimes, crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, mass torture, things of
So
that
it's more
nature,
based
where
on
there's
Nuremberg, if anything.
Exactly. That's the closest to what it is. And as you said, it had been 50 plus years since anything had been
Right.
done that was Nuremberg like. The two ad hoc tribunals added a little bit to the frustration that led to the ICC for two reasons. The first was just very simply and objectively, they were ad hoc.
Hmm.
They happened after the
But they
fact.
happened ad hoc
They
because there
happened
was no ICC. It was is right.
exactly, exactly. So the international community through the Security
Recognize the
Council
need,
was
maybe. Yeah.
forced to create or chose to create ad hoc tribunals for former Yugoslavia and Rwanda after the fact to try people. And these largely failed. Yugoslavia was a little bit more successful than Rwanda did. They both spent billions of dollars and had almost no accountability. Yugoslavia was a little bit better than Rwanda in that it wasn't strictly victor's justice, although there was a lot of that. There were a lot more Serbs tried. In Rwanda, it was only Hutus who were tried, even though there was a lot of evidence of war crimes committed by Tutsis in the militia coming in. There were only about 20 total people put on the docks in Rwanda, and there were a lot of government interference and other allegations. They were just horribly problematic processes, in no small part because they were after war had happened and they were set up ad hoc that way. The ICC is intended to put laws on the books and to have a justice system in place with a full legal system that includes prosecutors, that includes arrest warrants, that includes chambers to hear the initial trial, that includes chambers to appeal. All of this is part of the ICC process. The number one thing the ICC is missing, though, is an enforcement mechanism. There's no way for the ICC to arrest people, and that leads to a lot of political
And
considerations.
yet, well, maybe I'm wrong because the Bosnian culprits, Milosevic, but then really more significantly after Karadzic and Mladic, my understanding, I mean, they all sat in The Hague. And before I knew that, but my guess is that these were ICC cases, particularly
So
Mladic and Karadzic. I'm pretty sure those were ICC cases, right?
no, they were continuations of the Bosnian
A
tribunal. So
tribunal,
that was also held at the Hague. So it was the ad hoc tribunal for Bosnia that was also held at the Hague because it was in Europe and it was
and they were
convenient.
arrested.
The Rwanda they were, however, they were arrested by the Serbian government. And they, especially Milosevic, sat in Serbia as civilians for a
Milosevic
long
did. I
time.
thought Mladic and Karadzic were arrested by the peacekeepers when they stepped across.
One of them was
You know, they
that's
knew where
correct.
he
I
was,
thought
but
the
they
other
couldn't go because of the rules of the Dayton Accords. And then somebody
exactly. Yeah,
misstepped, and then they nabbed him and then sent him to The Hague.
yeah. Yeah, one was turned over,
That was
one was
Mladic.
arrested
Yeah.
immediately. But then Milosevic was a long, gray haired, gray bearded school teacher in rural
Yeah.
Serbia until politics turned and they finally turned him over and he was arrested. Serbia stood in the way. Yes, some of the
Mm.
top people did go on the docket. Serbia stood in the way of a lot of people being arrested because it
Yeah.
wasn't in Serbia's political
Hmm.
interest. This actually moves into the ICC too, and this is a good place where we can talk about a issue in the ICC process. So the U.S. brings this up, Israel brings it up. You'll hear U.S. politicians bring it up all the time. Well, they're just going to arrest our people. The U.S. is not a part of the ICC. Israel's not. Russia's not. China's not. And there's this fear that there's going to be politicized trials and that all of our people are going to be arrested. Here's the way it actually works. If the ICC indicts and puts out an arrest warrant against someone, what happens is all ICC members, which is the vast majority of the world, including most of Europe, all ICC members are told you must arrest these people if they come into your country and turn them over to the ICC. That is a normal part of international law. When you're a part of a treaty, you work with that treaty organization to fulfill it. So let's say someone in Israel, like Benjamin Netanyahu at this point, has an arrest warrant. Israel's not part of the ICC, so they have zero requirement to turn over Netanyahu or to turn over the defense minister who also has an arrest warrant. If those people come to the US has no requirement to turn those people over. Now, let's say they go to a European country. My favorite example of this is actually pre ICC. It is Henry Kissinger, the beloved or not beloved or most hated man in the world. Speaking with him of respect, may he rest in peace. But Henry Kissinger was under indictment in 40 plus countries for war crimes that he committed as Secretary of State or National Security Advisor. This included a number of European countries. He still sometimes traveled to those countries, but what he did was this diplomatic workaround that has been there for a long time, where when he was going to travel there, he wrote to their State Department, their Foreign Service, and he said, "Can I please get a letter saying that I will have safety traveling to your country?" And when he received that letter, he was able to travel there freely. Bashir in Sudan was indicted by the ICC as a sign of his obstinance and his force against the ICC. The minute he was indicted, he started traveling, he started planning his across Africa tour, and he went to over half the countries in Africa.
Why did they not arrest him?
They got letters. First of all, they gave him letters saying that he wouldn't
What
be
was
arrested.
their interest in doing that?
Their key interest was at that point in time, this was early 2000s, the ICC was only indicting African leaders.
Oh.
And the states of Africa were
Shocker.
pissed. And a number of African
Fair.
countries pulled out of the ICC
this.
saying, I can't see incorrectly, that it was biased.
Sure.
So the only people being indicted by the ICC for about the first 10, 15 years of the ICC were tiny country leaders. Nobody in big countries was being indicted.
Not tiny leaders in countries, but tiny.
Tiny countries, the leaders of tiny countries, often the big leaders of tiny
I got
countries.
a little worried.
Exactly. The big powers were never investigated. They were never indicted. Nobody was going to look into them. That is the number one change that we are seeing now. The fact that the ICC is going after Putin and Russia, and now that the ICC is going after Israeli leaders, not Hamas leaders, that's not a surprise that they're going after Hamas leaders. But the fact that Israeli leaders are being investigated and have arrest warrants, that's a change.
And now
for the ICC.
South Africa, in other words, in the ICJ, it is states bring cases against other states.
Correct.
Who generates the indictments in the ICC?
It is one of three things. It can either be the General Assembly of the UN, the Security Council of the UN, or the Prosecutor's Office of the ICC. And it's not uncommon. Countries will send information to the prosecutor's office requesting that they look into it. I don't actually know where this particular case started. We haven't seen all the historical details yet.
Clearly,
but this
Ukraine
came from
brought the charges against Putin because it was specifically on the abduction of the children. Probably Amnesty had a role in that. Like, could NGOs have a role in that?
It is possible, but I don't know that we have those details. And they might be hidden for a while the case is still going on. But it came to the prosecutor's attention, and the prosecutor's office decided to move forward and seek indictment and seek arrest warrants on these cases.
And who are they? Who are these prosecutors? I'm guessing they're not African. I'm guessing they're not tiny Africans.
They are international jurists. They are people from international systems. They are often past judges. They are often legal scholars. I'll give an example. A buddy of mine in Chicago, Bartram Brown, was a professor at Kent Law School who studied international law, studied human rights law, studied the ICC, and ended up as an assistant to one of the judges at the criminal tribunal for Yugoslavia. They look for experts. They look for people who know their stuff, who have written about it, who've acted in international affairs. So these are usually
But is an
professionals, even if it's
independent
someone.
organization, in other words, is not an arm of the United Nations. So the judges,
It is
the
not. No,
prosecutor, these people are not hired by the Secretary General or the Security Council. They're
correct.
entirely.
Yeah, the ICC is considered a special agency, so it's like the World Bank or the IMF. It is completely independent of the UN, but often works with the UN.
But the
But there's
IMF and the
no
World Bank, their
linkage.
leadership comes from the US or European Union largely, right? So how did those first judges at the ICC and the first, I guess it's a prosecutor general, I'm assuming is the title, how did they
Yep.
come to
Yeah, they're selected by the members. So
the member
ICC
states?
is a membership body. The members make the rules. The members can change the rules with a membership process. The members select, I believe it's just the top judges, and then they select the administrators who select staff and things like that. The members don't go through and select all of the staff for the ICC. But the different judges in the different courts are selected. They may be judges out of national systems. There are some very respected people out of national
And there are
systems
Americans
who,
working there for sure. Judges and yeah, yeah,
absolutely, yeah.
yeah. Um, well, that's interesting. Now, in terms of the cases current that are in the news currently before the
We should probably finish up with these.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. What's going to happen?
There's going to be a lot of talk
Uh-huh.
and a lot of complaining,
Mhm.
and it's going to take a lot of time for anything to happen. And we don't know exactly what that's going to be. Let me be really clear about one thing. Nobody's going to get arrested or indicted anywhere in the near
Right.
future by either the ICJ or the ICC in these Israel
But it has
cases.
had an effect.
It's
Putin cannot. He has not traveled to Davos, for example. He has not gone
right.
to other like he has. He didn't go to South Africa. I forget what the thing was that was
Yep.
happening there. So that is
Now,
significant.
Putin's in a weird position.
Yeah, in a lot of
So,
ways.
Putin, legalistically, as I said with Kissinger, Putin can now not travel to any country unless he gets permission to travel there. However, as a head of state, Putin also has diplomatic immunity, and it would be a major contest of international law for a country to actually arrest a head of state, a sitting head of state of another country for any
And yet
reason.
he's not
They
taking
could.
that risk. He's only
He's
going with a
not. No.
friendly
Now he could also
countries.
he could be kicked out of a country under law, but yeah, he hasn't left his country, and I think he probably personally sees that there's some risk to him there. Who knows what other risks he thinks might happen if he
But
leaves the
those
country
below
too?
him in Russia who also have been indicted could one would expect they would expect to be arrested, that they would not get that immunity if they were trying to travel.
It depends. It depends on if they're in a position that has that diplomatic immunity. So a foreign minister traveling as a foreign minister has immunity. A Secretary of the Treasury equivalent traveling in that form has diplomatic immunity. But again, they would check with those countries. And if you see someone who's making a Russian official who's making a visit to another country, you can assume part of that visit is a guarantee that if they're under investigation, indictment by the ICC, that they won't be
I
arrested.
can't remember her name, but the woman who is the minister for children's affairs, who's part of that indictment, she's not traveling to any international entity, any UN conference on children. She's not going anywhere because she's not going to. She might be promised the immunity and then be arrested upon arrival because
Right,
she's. I
right.
don't know her name off the top of my head. I have to look it up, and I'm an expert on this stuff.
Yep.
So
Now you also look at it though. Let's turn it to
yeah,
Israel. There are a lot of different levels going on here. This is not simply, Americans look at this and we see, oh, someone has an arrest warrant. The police are going to come up and arrest them. Well, that is
that
not
is
one of
not
the
going to
levels
happen.
that we are talking about. The different levels are, this is incredibly embarrassing. The fact that Netanyahu and the defense minister Gallant have been had arrest warrants put on them by the ICC is incredibly embarrassing to Israel. It's incredibly embarrassing to the United States as the primary country that's still just pretty much flat out defending Israel as we go along on this. Israel keeps saying they've done nothing illegal, and the ICJ and the ICC have now both said that Israel may be engaging in illegal action, to the point that the ICJ is willing to make a preliminary statement about it. The ICJ doesn't do that very often, by the way. They usually take the 4 or 5 years to run the case. It's rare for them to make some kind of preliminary statement suggesting a party shouldn't undertake an action or should cease action. In the ICC case, they put out an arrest
Yeah.
warrant. That is embarrassing. That says that it is likely some criminality happened. I'm going into legal language here because we should assume innocent until proven guilty, but we should also assume there's enough evidence to take a major power and a major political statement and say that they are guilty.
As my brother, who served both as a prosecutor and a defense attorney, used to say, if you're getting arrested for something, even if you're getting indicted for something, odds are you did something heinous. So,
I'll accept that as the statement that it is. But in this case especially, the political and the repercussions are horrible for the ICC and ICJ right now. They have created a storm here, and they knew they were creating it.
In both
and
of these
there's
cases,
no
Russia
way.
as well.
Exactly. There's no way those two organizations put themselves in the
Unless
middle of
they
this
knew.
unless they think something extremely significant is
Yeah.
happening. This is a gigantic political statement. The other thing with this political statement is we see the US and Israeli side. We don't see the European side, for instance. When the ICJ and the ICC say this, it suddenly becomes easier for European politicians to say that there are issues with Israel and with Hamas, by the way, too, in this case. But it's easier to say there is illegality going on here. It supports the states that want to fall back on the illegality of this situation and of the problems that are going on here. And that's a pretty big thing. It's also a moral indictment, and beyond the political, of these independent, objective international organizations have said that these states are engaging in moral wrong and moral and legal wrong.
And that's a really good point. I mean, we on this side of the pond sort of look askance at Europe and its idealism regarding international law, but the European Union is an outgrowth of step by step growing trust in and acceptance of international law among the various states of Europe. There is a European Union, but they are still sovereign states, and they have embraced the importance of and success of international law to the point where there's a European Parliament and they have standard codes. And so this means a lot to them, and I think it has gone a long way to preserving the united front in support of Ukraine.
And especially in human rights issues. There's a European Court of Human Rights that supersedes the Supreme Courts of the member states. That's huge,
so,
the fact that they took that step.
And so while there may never be a conviction in the ICJ or the ICC for either of these major conflicts right now, Israel, Gaza, or Russia, Ukraine, in either of those courts, either against the states or against the individuals, the political significance is real. Reputation matters to states. It really matters to Israel. I think it's a real.
Absolutely.
I mean, it might not matter as much to Russia, but
And
it could. Post-Putin, post-Putinism, I could see a scenario where that minister and the others indicted could, in fact, be face some kind of prosecution down the road.
Sure. There is a possibility. And even for Netanyahu and for Gallant, if they go out of political power, I don't think the Israeli government's going to turn them over, but that becomes a massive problem for them at that point in time, if those things are still standing.
And that could factor into negotiations regarding a permanent solution, a two-state solution.
Now, here is the other side, and where criminal questions, ICC questions, come in. It is typical that the ICC will not indict anyone. Bashir in Sudan was a great example of this, until all other steps have been taken. So what this is effectively saying, to some extent at least, is the international community is at the point of giving up on
Yeah.
stopping these human rights violations from happening, and it's now time to say we're going to take the legal steps. However, it is not uncommon that political solutions can cause international bodies to back off on those legal steps. So it could be perfectly
That could
reasonable for a political solution to include the ICJ
dropping.
withdraws the
Yep.
arrest
That could also
warrant.
happen. Yeah.
Exactly. Or ICC rather drops the arrest warrant. And yeah, that's absolutely could be a piece of this. We don't know whether it'll happen, but it's
But
possible.
I know much depends on basically for the whole world on what happens in November. Um, but if we can somehow take that consideration out of it and just think about things as if they were in a normal world, normal the way it has been, does the increased attention to the ICC as a result of these cases increase the pressure on the United States uh, to ascend to join? Uh,
To some extent. And frankly, the U.S. is moving in that direction. The latest U.S. ceasefire deal, which sounds like it's falling apart, but combined with the fact that some people in the White House are signaling that Biden may be willing to say this is more Netanyahu's fault than anything else, and that this may be more of a personal question of Netanyahu. I'm also going to come back with the answer that I've had since the beginning for the Israeli crisis as an example. I think that this is largely Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, the October 7th happened. October 7th, war crimes were committed. October 7th, I think you could suggest it was an attempt at genocide from Hamas. That being said, Israel had a right to self-defense and a right to respond. They did not have a right to respond the way they have. And this is what the ICJ and the ICC are both saying is not that Israel didn't have a right to self-defense. They absolutely did. The choices in self-defense were from Netanyahu and his government. And now, importantly, the end of this crisis is almost entirely a political issue for Benjamin
right.
Netanyahu. And I can see both the US changing position and this latest ICJ and ICC ruling adding on and building on the pressure to Netanyahu. The problem is, I can just as easily see those backing him into a corner. And yesterday we heard that his conservative
Correct.
allies backed him into a corner even
Yeah.
further and said, okay, if you take a ceasefire,
Yeah.
we're dropping the government and
Yeah.
we're going to end the government. He is in a horrific situation that is almost
Of
entirely
his
of his
own
own
making.
making.
Yeah. And yeah.
But thousands of people are dying
Correct.
because of it.
Correct.
It's terrible.
Whereas we don't have that kind of leverage with Russia. But other than that, the similar, almost everything you said about Netanyahu could be said about Putin. None of this happens without Putin or Putinism. He is individually responsible for this war and the consequences that have followed from it because there was no reason for it. It was completely made up from
Right.
his own warped goals and strategy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I want to go back to one thing, Joel. We have been dancing around the actual issues in Israel, particularly. And I'd like to get to what both the ICJ and ICC have said and what they
And
haven't
maybe
said
we
to
should
some
finish with
extent.
that. Yeah. Right.
It sounds
Great.
good. The ICJ case, way too many people are trying to read between the lines on the ICJ case. I think the ICJ was incredibly direct. They did not say this conflict must cease. They did not say Israel does not have a right to stop this conflict. Those simply weren't in there. What they said, and I'm going to read from it and then I'm going to translate it. This was May 24th, 13 votes to 2. The ICJ said that Israel should and quote, immediately halt its military offensive and any other action in the Rafah governorate, which may inflict on the Palestinian group in Gaza conditions of life that could bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part.
Right.
Unquote.
Stop
Now let
committing
me
genocide.
translate that. Exactly. That is the legalese. What the legalese is, Israel will immediately halt its military offensive if it is part of committing genocide. if that is committing genocide. When you look at the definition of genocide in the Genocide Convention, they lifted it. It is not some random language that we can interpret the words on. The Genocide Convention says one of the parts of genocide is deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to, quote, bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, which is exactly what the ICJ said. You can keep fighting, but stop committing genocide.
Right.
Stop doing things that are likely legally considered genocide. And that is going after civilians indiscriminately. That is creating conditions of life such as lack of water, lack of food, lack of sanitation, lack of health care. That is moving people, pushing people out of their homes. That is destroying their homes. There are an enormous number of things. It's not just mass killing. Genocide has a variety of different definitions. And sadly, I think that there's legal reason to believe that the Israeli attacks are going to be seen that way. Historically, I think they're going to be assessed that way.
And thus
and then
the
on war
pressure on
crimes,
Israel, because that language is not lost on any citizen of Israel.
absolutely not. And Israel's been trying to parse the language, and U.S. legislators have been trying to parse the language. The language is
The language is the
direct.
language. It's clear.
It has meaning, absolutely. And then you look at war crimes in the ICC, and it's all the same stuff. Israel is violating three particular areas of war crimes. By the way, Hamas is violating many war crime statutes too.
And Hamas leaders are also indicted by the ICC.
Absolutely.
And Russian leaders are indicted by the ICC. Again, the same language, the abduction of children, the forced abduction of children is also, and the conditions created to destroy a population in whole or in part is also part of their indictment.
And on the Israeli side, most of it goes around attacking civilians. Yes. There are a very limited number of cases in which civilian deaths can be an acceptable part of war. You have to distinguish between fair targets. You have to say, this is a target and this isn't, and we are unlikely to hit civilians.
None of that.
You have to look at proportionality. If you're going to kill a legitimate target, you can't kill
1,000 illegitimate targets. Right.
Exactly. Right. And that's civilians. And then indiscriminate attacks. Right. I got to tell you, I don't know how a 500 or 2,000 pound bomb dropped on a building could ever be considered a discriminate attack. Almost by definition, those are indiscriminate attacks. Now, the problem is for Israel and for the U.S., this is the way we fight wars.
Yep.
And you got a whole lot of U.S. legislators who hate this stuff because the United States doesn't get accused of this because we're big and powerful. That doesn't mean we don't do it. So even I'm going to go to the Obama administration for a minute. Many people think Obama's use of drones were war crimes almost every time they were used. And the European Union has talked about this. We are likely guilty of war crimes. I support the United States. I don't support our leaders committing war crimes. Those are two completely different things. I support the right of Israel to exist and to self-defense. I don't support Israeli leaders committing war crimes. I support the Palestinian people. I don't support Hamas committing war crimes. Those are different things, and we need to separate.
And just to be clear, Russia's tactics are exactly the same. Their technology is even more rudimentary than ours. I will say that in the case of U.S. drone strikes, the technology is and the guidance technology is orders of magnitude more accurate now than they were during the Obama administration. We carry out fewer attacks, but they're much more precise of late. I mean, that was early use of drone technology. It's much more accurate.
And yet there are still questions about whether we're indiscriminate.
For sure. Well, I think we need to wrap it up there. It's a good discussion. Thanks for your expertise on this, Brian.
Excellent. Happy to do it. Thanks for the questioning and for playing the every person role too.
Legitimately, there's a lot that I really learned. So thanks.
Excellent. Nope. Great talking as always.
Until next time.